Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and that, of course, means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment, good. We're going to be talking a little bit of little radio, little television, little film. Primary focus here is going to be on television, but and those glorious days of old black and white television. Indeed, some of you remember that. Some of you remember life before cable and satellite dish and Netflix and all of that. We're going to be talking to a guy that knows it well. Julian Stone. He grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, located in L.A. later after his college years. He wrote screenplays for Disney, Paramount, TriStar, MGM, as well as several other producers. His recent works include a full-length play, The Elvis Test, and the direction of 2 short-form music videos and documentaries on Frank Sinatra. Notable screenplays from Julian include Brooklyn Dodgers-focused comedy Duke Snider Eats Here, and quite a bit of music industry satire. It should be a good one. Julian, how are you, my friend?
I'm good. It's great to be talking to you.
Well, we're going to be talking, you got a brand new work called The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death, Justice Girl. That alone kind of hails back to the era of the 1950s when there were superheroes abound in many forms on television. What about this particular genre is so interesting to you, and why such a focus for you?
Well, I've just always been fascinated by the era of live television from 1946 to about 1956, where all television was live, because you had this amazing art form called live TV that existed for 10 years, flourished, and then absolutely disappeared with the advent of videotape. And I just, a lot of people have just completely forgotten about it. Like, you hear about the golden age of television, but people don't realize that it can, they still think of it in the context of today's television. They don't realize that it was this unique form of it going out live, and it was unbelievable, the works that they would attempt, that they weren't worried at all by this limitation of being live. If anything, the people were excited by it and, sort of got off on the rush of it. And one of the most interesting things about it was when I talked to people who had worked in it, to a person, not a one of them wanted it to end. It just ceased to exist.
Julian, we think now about live TV, we think about live anything, and some of us that have been in this business for a long, long time get a little bit nervous, particularly with live television. But back then, did they know anything different?
No, they were just as ultimately I think they were just as nervous and excited and thrilled by it. It was just there really wasn't an option. So it didn't really. It was, if you were going to do television, this is what you were going to do, because they didn't even just recently, this last week, NBC had that live Sound of Music that they put on, and they promoted it so heavily, live, and it's just ironic when you go back and look at the stuff that I'm talking about from the late 40s and early 50s. They don't even bother to mention live because there was no other option. It was just the only way it was done.
When you think back and you think about the 40s in particular, but even, frankly, the 50s up until late 50s, television was not widespread. And I'm curious as to, today, if Julian Stone writes a television play, that it can be seen by anybody, coast to coast, any age, basically any income level, and certainly geographically anywhere. Back then, and again, we don't expect you to be a television historian, but were they approaching things differently just because the reach of television in that early age was not anywhere near what it is today?
Well, you bring up an excellent point. It actually did expand pretty rapidly, but in those early days, I'll just give you a little bit of context. In 1946, right when the war ended, there were 6,000 televisions in the United States. By 1951, that number had risen to 12 million. So it was moving fast, but certainly in those earlier days, it was mostly, and in the early 50s, mostly concentrated in the major cities. So the writing was much more written to, for lack of a better term, a little bit more of a sophisticated audience. So there was definitely harder-hitting issues that were dealt with. And also these writers were, a lot of them were driven. They were ex-soldiers, and they were driven by what they had been through in the war. So they were writing with that type of a voice, and they had a very receptive audience in these major cities. And as television throughout the 50s began to spread into more and more markets and farther away from the city, some of it did start to get a little diluted down by the pressures of sponsors and just wanting to appeal to a larger audience instead of worrying about a more urban center that was seeing their work.
What about also, again, with this new medium of television, when they were writing and they were thinking about doing it live, the production value of today's shows are so high, whether it's special effects, the use of animation and computerized graphics and computerized images. The idea of producing a flashback, for example, is no big deal, or flashing forward with special effects into the future. Back then, they didn't have that. Did that not necessarily limit, but it certainly must have framed the kinds of stories and kind of things they wanted to present or were able to?
No question, and Kat, there were sort of two schools of thought. One was that they sort of did amazing work ignoring that and just doing any trick that they could think of to make it look larger and much more than it was. And then the other one was that they developed these type of dramas which came to be known as kitchen sink dramas because they were sort of smaller ones that could be done on limited sets, and it became sort of a genre. Some of the classics of this are Marty is often talked about. The Patty Chayefsky piece that starred Rod Steiger is one of the classics of this sort of small genre of few characters talking and very character-driven stories. And Rod Serling did a lot of this work, too, that he was famous for, patterns and things like that. So that was kind of how they dealt with it. They sort of evolved these dramas that fit very well in the new medium of live television.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Our guest this segment is Julian Stone. He grew up in the San Francisco area and spent many years writing for Disney, Paramount, TriStar, MGM, as well as several other producers. We're talking today specifically about that glorious era of live television in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, and specifically a novel about that called Justice Girl, The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death, with the dramatic title that undoubtedly it deserves. You talk about Rod Serling is a good example, certainly groundbreaking in many respects, a bright guy. I'm curious as to, if you take us back into that early era of television, who were the logical directors and writers? Did they come necessarily from Broadway? Did they come from radio and they sort of jumped over to television? As they say, a lot of times people have the face for radio. I'm wondering if the same writing is true, making that leap to television encompassed so many more additional elements.
Yeah, it's interesting. That was part of what made live television so amazing, was that you had, because it was mostly, particularly in the early days, based around New York, you had some of the finest Broadway actors who were just set. They moved very easily into live television because that's what they'd essentially been doing, which was live performance. So they were much more comfortable with it than, say, movie stars who were, used to just doing a little bit of a scene. You had all these great actors who were just used to doing plays. So essentially, they did the same thing, just having to deal with the technical aspects of having a camera in your face. So a great amount of the actors came out of the New York scene, the actor studio, which is part of the excitement. You see some of James Dean's earliest work, Paul Newman. I mean, you can just go down the list of people that this is where they began. A lot of the technical people did come over from radio. Some directors did come from movies, but a lot of the technical people, particularly in the very beginning, this was their first job. So they kind of all grew up together and they all kind of created this thing as they were sort of figuring it out right after the war ended. It was just sort of evolving all at once. There weren't a lot of there weren't a lot of movie people in the beginning. In the very beginning, it was definitely looked down upon, and then when it obviously exploded in the early 50s, there was a little bit of a sea change, and more established names started doing it, seeing that this wasn't going to go away, it wasn't a fad, and that as they were getting less and less work, perhaps in their movie career, this wasn't such an alternative to still get paid to be on. To be seen by the public. And some of the radio network people, or I should say the radio networks, CBS, NBC, who had these huge radio networks, they were able to make the transition as a company much more easily than some of the other people that companies that tried to get into just get into television. I talk about I made up a network for my novel called the Regal Television Network, and it's kind of loosely based on, there was a fourth network in the early 50s called the Dumont Network. And one of the problems that the real Dumont Network had was that they didn't come from the background of a radio network. So they didn't have this natural talent base. So that's why they always had competition competing with the other networks, and ultimately why they vanished, because they just couldn't keep up with the talent that the other networks had.
Well, let's dive in here a little bit and dive into the meat of this thing. Let's talk about Justice Girl. I think we kind of get what the motivation was here, but this is obviously a labor of love for you. Give us a little background on the idea and what brought you to this point.
Sure. Well, as I've said, I've always been fascinated by this era. I first discovered Rod Serling in my teenage years, and then sort of following his career, you start with The Twilight Zone, the thing he's most famous for, and then you look back and see that before The Twilight Zone, he was the most famous writer of the golden age of television. He wrote many amazing pieces, and some of the seminal works, Patterns, Requiem for a Heavyweight, they're very well known. And from that love affair, I always wanted to do something in that era. And sometimes, as a screenwriter, you get ideas that you love, but you just know that they're not going to translate into a screenplay. It's tough enough writing period pieces, even though I've had some success with them, but you just know that this story just isn't going to fit in that box. And the idea for Justice Girl was one of those. I came up with this idea about a young writer that suddenly overnight becomes a sensation with this show, and it's about this show that he creates called Justice Girl, and it's about all the different forces that begin to sort of want their piece of the pie of the success of this show. And that's sort of where it all came from. And then realizing that it really wasn't going to fit into a screenplay, I decided to go the route of a novel. And I had dabbled with it with a couple of other ideas over the years that I was happy with, but they didn't come out exactly the way I wanted to. And this one, taking what I learned from those, I'm incredibly proud of, and I've been very thrilled by the response it's gotten thus far.
Well, you've written for film, you've written for video, you've written for the play, you've written for television, now you've written a book. Tell us, no one better than you, to share what are the challenges of each one. Is one necessarily easier than another, and is there one that you prefer?
Well, I'll tell you, the challenges can also be helped by the limitations. Like, I'll give you an example. When you write a screenplay, going in, you're going to have to come in around 110 pages. So right away, it becomes its own wonderful self-editing mechanism. It keeps you from being able to go too crazy. So that's the help in terms of, that's one of the things that is a challenge, but it also can help you in the limitations. But the excitement about writing a novel, which is why I gravitated this, and frankly, it's the direction I want to go in at this point, was the opposite, that you could go anywhere you wanted, and there was no problem. I'll give you an example. In my novel, Justice Girl, when I started writing it takes place in 1955, but as I started doing it, I have three major characters in the story, and more it ended up that each one of them I was able to write into the story as part of the story, these great sections of the book that deal with each one of these characters' experiences 10 years earlier during World War II on the American home front. And it was just great to realize that that's where the story was taking me, and that I could use that. And if I was writing a screenplay, that would not have been an option. You just could, maybe I could throw in a little bit of a flashback, but those are so weird, that you don't. It's done very different than it used to be, and it ends up eating up some of your page count, and it doesn't often work. Where with a novel, if that's where the story took me, that's where I could go. And that's very exciting, and that's where I'm more excited and more concentrating now going forward.
Right. I would think you kind of hinted at this, the idea of writing a book, you're completely autonomous, are you not? Oh,
absolutely. Absolutely. It depends on what level you're doing it at. I'm sure there's certain people who write in certain genres. I have friends that have written science fiction, for instance, and, the notes that would come back, particularly if one friend in particular was writing for a well-known genre, not only science fiction, but a well-known part of the genre, a series that had been around for quite a while. So when he was doing that, there was definitely, he couldn't, go too far off a certain path. There's certain rules that you have to stick to, and if you're telling the story of a character that fits in with a larger timeline of of other characters and other stories, you have to stay within certain parameters. So that's one aspect of it. But if you're doing it on your own and you're creating it from whole cloth, yeah, you can go anywhere you want.
If Justice Girl is a sort of a loving look and tribute and all those various nostalgia and much more, I realize, but if that's your tip of the hat, so to speak, to those early years, what's a sort of a logical next step for you?
In terms of what I want to write next?
Yeah, what's a logical next subject for you?
Well, it's really funny. The next book that I'm working on, which I've been working on for a little bit, actually grew out of this novel. It was part of a scene that I was writing within this novel. And at the time, when I wrote it a couple of years ago, when I was at that part of the story, I just remembered going, when I read, it was only one or two lines in my novel, and I went, God, that's a great idea for a story of its own. So when this one was done, I kept thinking about that, and that's what I've been developing since then. That to take this one little tiny section and turn it into a full-blown novel.
As you were talking about that writing books anyway seems something that's awfully attractive to you. Does that mean you sort of speak, turn your back on some of the other stuff you've been doing with the other venues and other ways to communicate, or do you still want to do both?
I still want to do both, but the reality also in this business is as you get a little older, it's a little tougher, to get work as a screenwriter. And the last couple of jobs that I've done, I have been working with other people, part of some of their deals. I've co-written some stuff with some people, but it's not only the age issue, but I think as you get older, the passion to write certain stuff that's required in screenwriting kind of diminishes, and I find myself frankly more excited about being able to write whatever I want and not really thinking in screenwriting terms. I still have some screenplays in me, and I still have one or two that I want to do, particularly that I'm passionate about. But right now I am very much focused on doing novels.
Well, it is a tremendous work. The work is called Justice Girl: The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death of Justice Girl, a novel by Julian David Stone, longtime writer for television, film, and more. And David, again, it is an interesting work. It is obviously a strong work of love for you. It must have been a joy to write. And anyway, here's one thing for sure that we for sure need to know, and that is, how can we find out a little bit more about your work and also find out and get a copy of this work?
Sure. I have a website, juliandavidstone.com, which has some of the projects we talked about. I have a couple of really fun pieces that I did for the Frank Sinatra estate, some documentaries that are on there that are really fun to see. Plus, I have a feature film I directed called Follow the Bitch, which is about guys that play poker. And it's about an all-night poker game that a woman comes in and plays at for the first time. That's a feature I made a few years back, and all of that is on the website. And you can see the films, the documentaries, and you can see the trailer for the feature. Plus, you can read more about Justice Girl, and the book is available right now at Amazon.com, both paperback and Kindle.
Well, listen, thanks so much for spending part of your day with us. Enjoyed it thoroughly, and best of luck down the line. We'll look for you on bookshelves, I guess, instead of on television in the future. But again, thanks so much.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.